Okay, so in this video, it is a translation and discussion of chapter 29, Going to the Market. And as per usual, as I go through the translation, I'll be embedding certain items to the camera, spelling it out for you, that you can then put those items into Canvas and earn yourself an easy free 100 simply by watching this video and preparing. So, let's go ahead and get started. Cornelia summa celeritate se paravit. Cornelia did prepare, has prepared, with perfect stem and a perfect ending. And say, of course, is the reflexive pronoun sui, sibi, say, the accusative form. And so it's either going to be himself, herself, itself, or themselves. And you know the translation because reflexives reflect back onto the subject. So since Cornelia is she prepared herself, ablative of manner, with the greatest speed. In this chapter we learn the word celeritas, which is the nominative, celeritas, and celeritatis, and that is the word for speed, in which you see it in the most famous of all scientific equations, E equals mc squared. C is the speed of light. Energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. And since celeritas means speed or celerity, then obviously it is the abbreviation C that we use. Very often you see the tatis nouns, as I like to say them, that can be somewhat tricky and confusing, because when you look at celeritas, you might think that it is necessarily a accusative plural feminine, but instead there are many, many words that are nouns that are created from actual adjectives that have tas as its nominative form. That's the variant. You can see it with the form of the word from brevis, breve. Let me rewrite it. So brevis would of course be the adjective, brevis, breve, but then you turn it into the noun brevitas, and thus you get the English word, and you can replace that as with a y, brevity. You can also have the word from heavy, which is gravis, heavy or serious, that will then turn into gravitatis, in which then we get, of course, gravity. And so be aware that those are nouns that exist in abundance in Latin that will be coming along with more and more frequency. So, she prepared herself with the greatest speed. Brevi tempore, in a short time, and there's that word that I just turned into brevitas, brevity, shortness. Mom and the daughter, they feribantur. And so here now at Ecce Romana we're starting to see for the first time passive forms, but we've already seen passive forms before. It says that the mom and the daughter were being carried per urbem, through the city, by slaves. And so we're going to begin to seeing what we call the ablative of personal agent. And the ablative of personal agent is going to be the doer of the action, because remember, with a passive verb, the subject does not do the action, but is acted upon. And so when the subject is acted upon, it is your ablative of personal agent. You'll recognize an ablative of personal agent because it'll have an a or an ob that we see there, with an ablative word as the object of that a or ob. And so the mother and daughter, were being carried through the city by the slaves. In the streets, in the roads, there was a huge multitude of genitive plural men. And so, or humans if you would like. Multitudo is the other kind of noun that you can obviously create from an adjective. The adjective was multi, as in many. And so multitudo would be the representation of that many, i.e. a multitude. You can do it easily with the word that means strong, which of course is fortis, fortis, forte, and thus you end up with meaning strong, fortitudo. And the genitive then would be fortitudinis. And so in that way, you can again have a rather tricky kind of nominative form, because it ends with a long O. Not an ending, but it ends with the letter long O, but it is the variant form, and thus you will not then be confused, because just like we replace the AS of brevitas with a Y or gravitas, you in English will replace that O with an E, and you get the word fortitude. If you take longus aum, you get longitudo, longitude, length, or latus aum, and that is the word for wide, and so therefore you end up with latitudo, or width, latitude, if you would like. And so therefore, in the streets, there was a huge multitude, a large multitude of men. Curcasavant enum servi, milites, viri, pueri, mulieres. And here we have a syndeton. There is no ands whatsoever. And so it says, enum, for, slaves, soldiers, men, boys, women. And they're all going to be intermixed and interspersed. It's not as though they're going to have a spot for the slaves over here, a spot for the soldiers over here, a spot for the men over here, for the women over here, for the boys over here, but rather they're all mixed in together. Now, we also have something interesting with our verb concursavant, and this is an example of what we call a frequentative. A frequentative verb is a verb that is created from the fourth principal part of another verb, and it implies a repeated action. So, for example, this is the verb curro, currere, cucurry, and then cursus. Now, it has a cone on the front of it just to merely emphasize or intensify it, and we'll put it there. But what you will do is that you will then take the fourth principal part, you take away, and I need to fix that because I erased too much, and now you will create a first conjugation verb, concurso, concursare, concursavi, and it doesn't mean just to run, but rather it means to run repeatedly. And so one way that we idiomatically can say it into English is that we would say run about, as in run to, run fro, run this way, but run constantly. The best example, I think, that we encounter in Latin 1 and 2 for this kind of a frequentative, it is also called an iterative verb, is the verb spicio, spicere, spexi, spectus. So it of course means to spot. You put a cone on the front and it is catch sight of or spot that you learned in chapter 4. Well, if you get to the fourth principal part, it is the word spectus aum, but you take that stem of the fourth principal part and you turn it into a first conjugation noun or first conjugation verb, specto, spectate, spectavi, spectatus, and what does it mean to spot repeatedly, to spot frequentatively, to spot iteratively? It means to watch. And so the English word in and of itself, watch, is a frequentative action because it implies that you are doing something over and over again. And so that is an example of that frequentative that we have there in the sentence that of course has that ascendaton with them all being bunched together. Honora ingentia a serois portabantur. And that is your nominative plural neuter subject of our passive verb. Huge loads from the noun onus oneris. And remember, if it is a third declension noun whose nominative happens to have us, I did not say ending, then it is going to be a neuter word, and thus your nominative and accusative plural ends in a. Huge loads were being carried by the slaves. Again, another ablative of personal agent. Nam inter diu, for during the day, nihil. Nothing, portatur, is carried, is being carried, present passive, intra urbem, inside the city, by vehicle. And please note, we said by the slaves, and by vehicle. But ablative of personal agent, a or ab, and it's a person. Ablative of personal agent, a or ab, and it's a person. That's not a person, and there is no a or ab, but it is your ablative. But this is your ablative of means, by vehicle. It is the means by which it gives the ability for that stuff to be carried. So, for during the day, nothing is carried by vehicle inside the city. And please do not confuse intra with its other word that is similar to it, inter. Inter means between, intra means inside. Like intramural sports in college is the sport teams, then leagues that are made inside the walls of the school instead of interscholastic, which would be between schools, as it were. And this is your first word that you're going to put in, I-N-T-R-A, intra. Intra is your first word, I-N-T-R-A. So, continuing on, it says, Omnia quae videt Cornelia eam delectant. So, all which Cornelia sees delights her. And omnia is your subject of the thing, plural, the things which delight her. So, all the things delight her. All the things quae, which Cornelia sees. Now, very quickly, if you were to go look to see in the chart of relatives, and hopefully I have it pulled up here so where we can see it rather quickly, and there we go. If you will note, and let's make it a little bit larger, there it is, maybe we can see it better, that the Kwai is going to appear in 1, 2, 3, 4 different spots, and so we have to figure out which one. Is it nominative singular feminine, nominative plural neuter, or accusative plural neuter? Well, we will go back and see on the other item that is there, chapter 29, alrighty. And so, if it is going to be the relative that, oh, I didn't mean to do that, there it is. So if it is the relative, gonna get rid of it, there it is, it's only that right there is our relative clause. Taking as its antecedent omnia, thus we know that the Kwai is not feminine, because that is neuter in plural, meaning that is neuter in plural. But is it neuter plural nominative? Qui, quai, quai, quorum, 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 quibus, 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 quos, quas, quai, or is it accusative plural? Well, it's accusative plural because Cornelia is doing the seeing. So all the things which Cornelia sees that which. And so therefore we know that it is accusative because in its clause it is the direct object, but it is plural because its antecedent is plural, and it is neuter because its antecedent is neuter as well. Nunc conspicit. Now, she spots, she catches sight of a poet. But it is a recitantem poet. That is a present active participle. Take us what kind. Remember that you translate present active participles that you can recognize because of the form as verbing. This is obviously the word reciting. Now she spots a poet reciting verses. If you think of the chart of the fourth declension, that long US could be genitive singular of a verse, nominative plural, verses, do things, or here, accusative plural, answering whom or what reciting verses. So now she spots a poet reciting verses. Now, and you imply the conspicit again, she spots beggars, mendicos, a new word in this chapter, seeking money. Pententes is modifying mendicos, but it is taking as its object pecuniam. So now she spots beggars seeking money. Now she spots, implied again, a most elegant, a very elegant litter, quai, which is being carried, portatur in the present passive, by 8 slaves. A couple of things going on here. This quai is taking as its antecedent lecticam, and so unlike that quai, which was neuter and plural and accusative, this one is singular and feminine, and it is the subject of its clause, and so therefore it is nominative, singular, and feminine. And here we have yet again an ablative of personal agent. And remember that octo is actually modifying servis. All numbers in Latin outside of unus, which is 1, duo, which is 2, and tres, which is 3, do not decline. And so therefore its cases depend upon what it is actually modifying. It just happens to have a form that ends with a long O, but it is here an ablative plural. In ea. In it. This is of course from is, ea, id, eis, 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 ae, and so forth and so on, and it is of course the ablative singular, the object of your preposition in. So in it, and the reason why I say it instead of her, even though it's feminine, is that it is referring to the lecticon. So in it, a homo obesus, a fat man, and that is your nominative variant form, homo hominis, reclines, recumbo recumbere, a new word in this chapter, and from which you get the word recumbent, a bicycle in which you lay down and pedal it, or recline and pedal it. A fat man, qui, who reads a book, is reading a book, does read a book. And so that is singular because homo is singular. That is masculine because homo is masculine. And that is nominative because in its clause, it's its own subject. The who is doing the reading. And it just happens to have the same exact case as its antecedent, which is also nominative because it is the subject, is homo of recumbit. Your second item that you're going to be putting in is that recumbit. R-E-C-U-M-B-I-T. Spell it correctly. R-E-C-U-M-B-I-T. Subito, continuing on. Suddenly, Cornelia conspicit. Cornelia catches sight of. Oh, by the way, hopefully you caught that in the previous paragraph. There's the tricolon crescanes. She spots the poet, she spots the beggar, she spots the litter, bum 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 bum. But a nice both tricolon crescanes and an asyndeton, because it's almost cinematically as though she sees it all three simultaneously unfolding. It's not like, now is the time to spot the poet, now is the time to spot the beggars. Because the street is crowded, it is obviously going to have all the people doing all the stuff simultaneously, the asyndeton. Subito, suddenly Cornelia spots duos servos, two slaves, but what kind? Present active participle modifying it, hurrying through the street. Alter quorum. Remember with the alter, you can always assume that maybe imply that there'll be another alter to follow, and so the one alter is the one, and the other alter will be the other. One of whom carries a parvuum, a little bitty, an itty bitty pig. Not just parvus, but parvulum with the diminutive form. Remember, diminutive is a word that has been altered in a slight way to imply a smaller version. So it's not little, but little bitty. And so we again have another relative clause, starting with quorum, that takes as its antecedent something plural and either masculine or neuter, and so it is the slaves. The slaves, one of whom carries a little pig. Eo ipso tempore, by, with, because of, from, in, on, at, that time itself. A couple of things going on here quickly is that from is a id, a-e, it means he, she, it, or him, her, it, and then in the plural, they or them. But when it is actually modifying something, it will take on the equivalency of being either a hikai hoke, so you can say at this time itself, or leila lud, at that time itself. Now, ipso, of course, does mean itself from ipse ipsa sum, but whenever it is modifying, we're going to see this again a little bit later, so pay close attention to that. So when is a id, like what we see right here, is modifying it, it is going to then be this whatever or that whatever, and if it's plural, of course, these and those. So at that time itself, the pig escapes in the present tense. All I need to do in order to make this perfect is to make that U long. It would happen to have the same letters, but if fugit is escape, did escape. But here it is present because there is no long U. A pig escapes out of his hands. Cavete exclamant adstantes. Be careful, cavete, the adstantes. Now, what we're doing is we're taking this present active participle and we're substantizing it. We're saying the ones standing at that place, standing by. And so the ones standing at that place, or standing by, is then going to become the bystanders. But literally, it is the present active participle, which is an adjective that we then substantize to become bystanders. So immediately, or I should say, the bystanders, the ones standing by, yell out, but in vain. Homo quidam. Now remember, you take qui, quo, quis, and once you add the dom to it as a suffix, it is now going to mean a certain. But remember, you don't look at the dom to figure out what it modifies, you look at the qui part. And since qui is nominative and singular, just like we saw, qui then relate back to homo, this quidam is modifying the homo, nominative, singular, masculine. A certain man, qui, who, and actually now we need to write in red for my relative clause, which is subordinate, who is running through the street quickly, he, non potest, is not able to avoid vitare, the pig. Back in chapter 13 when they got into the crash, we learned that word because the carriage driver was not able to avoid that quick little chariot which was on the road. Ad terram cadet. He falls, he is falling, he does fall to the ground. Please don't say he falls to the earth, he is not a meteor. Paulisper, for a short time, he, the one groaning, lies. If it were throws, it would be yak it from yakio yakere versus the second conjugation yakeo yakere, to lie down. So for a short time, he, the groaning guy, lies in the mud. Idiomatically, we would say, for a short time, he lies in the mud, groaning. He, the one groaning. A present active participle in the nominative singular, modifying my understood subject, he. Dende, then, having been moved by anger, Ablative of cause, and that's a perfect passive participle, again, modifying the understood subject, he, the guy that was not able to avoid the pig. Having been moved by anger, he seeks, he looks for the slave. A quo, from whom, here it's not going to be by, but rather from, seeing as it's not an ablative of personal agent with a passive verb, from whom the pig has escaped. And so previously we saw that you, short, thus meaning escapes, right now in the present tense, versus that long U now making it perfect, and that AU is really the letters A, B. And so here it is an EX, not EF, EF by assimilation, and here it is an AB, not an AU, AU instead by assimilation. So, from whom the pig has escaped. Est rixa. It is a fight, a rixa, a quarrel, as it were. Your third item that you're going to be putting in is that present active participle gemains, G-E-M-E-N-S, modifying the subject gemains, G-E-M-E-N-S. Finishing off with the final paragraph. Finem rixae non videt Cornelia, quod servi jam celas in aliam viam tolerant. So your subject is obviously going to be Cornelia. Cornelia did not see, perfect tense, video videre vidi visus. If it were present tense, it'd be V short ID, present stem, and it's a second conjugation, so your jug in the middle is an E, and thus then you have your T. He sees, videt, versus she saw. So she did not see, has not seen the end of the fight, the quarrel, quod. Now, when we see that quod, it is obviously a subordinating word, but it does not have a neuter singular antecedent, and so it is not the which, but rather what we call a causal clause, because the slaves already had pluperfect tense carried pharaoh ferry tililatus, the sedan chairs in plus accusative into or onto another street. And so it is, of course, unable to see what happens with this kind of showdown in the streets between the slaves with the pig and the one person that got knocked over. Tandem, at last, advenerunt. They arrived, they did arrive, they have arrived, they have come to the shop. Now, again we see eam. If it were just eam, it would be the regular old personal pronoun from isea id, to it, to her. But because it is modifying tabernam, then it is going to be the equivalency and essentially turn into the demonstrative. So you can have it as the equivalency of hic haec hoc, to this shop, or ele ela elud, to that shop. And it is the shop, quam, which they were seeking. Quam is singular because tabernam is singular. It is a relative. It is feminine because tabernam is feminine, but it is accusative because in its clause in the red, it is the accusative direct object of the verb petevant, whereas this is accusative because it is the object of the preposition odd. They don't have to have the same case, do the relative and the antecedent. They do have to have the same number and the same gender. So, nevertheless, continuing on. Sorry about that, but it says, De celis descenderunt, they climbed down, did climb down, have climbed down from the sedan chairs. Tum Aurelia inquit. Then Aurelia said, we disti, nay indicating question, isti is the perfect ending, weed is the perfect stem. Did you see that litter in qua, in which the fat man was reclining? And again, a relative that you would have as an antecedent, lecticam, in which the fat man was reclining. Unus e libertis Caesaris ipsius, one out of the freedmen, that is what a libertus is, you can see it down here, of Caesar himself. So you see Aurelia as one of the upper echelon of society, but even she is always looking to kind of climb socially because she has a level even above her as a senatorial class, and the one level above her is the imperial class, the class of the emperor. And so she is going to note this fellow who had been a personal slave of the emperor, who is now a freedman of the emperor, and thus probably he still has close connections with the emperor, which of course they refer to as Caesar, which of course Caesaris in the genitive is modified by ipsius. Ipse, ipsa, ipsum, ipsius, ipsius, ipsius. And since Caesar is a he, we will translate it himself. Had it been a feminine, it would be herself. And if it had been a me, it'd be myself. If it had been a you, it'd have been yourself, and so forth and so on. It all matters as to what it is modifying, which makes it different than the, of course, reflexive himself, herself, itself, or themselves. Ipsius, as a matter of fact, your fourth item, I-P-S-I-U-S. I-P-S-I-U-S of Caesar himself. And so we're almost done. Let's go ahead and get there. Sed quid occidit. But what happened? Now note, and I've said about occidit before, but if you look at occidit's principal parts, its first principal part is going to not have an O because it is always third person. And most often it is actually going to be impersonal, as in it happens. The second principal part looks normal, occidere. And then the third principal part is again occidit, which tells to you that here what we have in the first principal part is a present stem, present vowel, present ending. But in that third principal part, you are going to have a perfect stem and a perfect ending. But the point is both the present and the perfect are identical in their forms. And so you have a choice as to whether you can say, but what happens, what is happening, what does happen right now, versus what happened, what did happen, what has happened already, and it's over with. It's your choice, but I think that it would be better in the context to indicate it as perfect. But what happened, what has happened. Fumum video, I see smoke, et flammas, and flames. Fumum and flammas being the accusative direct objects, two of them, of your verb video. And your final word is that occidit, A-C-C-I-D-I-T. A-C-C-I-D-I-T. Lots of stuff to talk about in this passage, lots of stuff to ask about on the multiple choice. So I encourage you, make sure you study and make sure you know your forms, know your content, and know your vocabulary. Good luck as always. Thanks so much for watching. Free 100 for you.